Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're tackling, something that we don't talk about too often, I think. We tend to focus a lot on the humanitarian side of things. And today we're going to be looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and really kind of focusing in on the economic fallout from this conflict, specifically kind of zeroing in on Israel. And we've got a really fascinating source here that really kind of digs into some of the nitty-gritty, the numbers, and reveals how much this is costing, not just in lives, but in actual dollars and cents. What's it doing to the economy?
Yeah, it's really interesting how much attention is paid to the devastation in Palestine, which is, absolutely tragic and terrible. But you're right, you rarely see a deep dive into what's happening in Israel and their economy. I mean, this source really paints a picture of an economy that was, really booming. I mean, just a couple of years ago, they were, performing really well.
Let's rewind a bit. Before the Hamas attack in October of 2023, Israel's economy was growing at a pace that was really, most countries would be envious of
Oh,
that.
absolutely. In 2021, they saw a GDP growth of 6.8%. And then in 2022, 4.8%. So, I mean, these are healthy numbers for a developed nation. Just to give you some context there, the U.S. during that same period, was averaging around 2.3% growth. So Israel was really killing it.
So like night and day kind of difference there. So what happened? What's the situation like right now?
So now in Q4 of 2023, they saw a 19.4% drop in their GDP.
Whoa.
I know, it's pretty jarring to see, and it's not projected to get much better going into 2024. I mean, just to really let that sink in for a moment. During the 2008 financial crisis, the US, which obviously has a much larger, more diversified economy, only saw a GDP decline of around 8.4% at its worst point.
Wow, that's really something. So, what does this actually mean for people on the ground? Like if their GDP is shrinking like that, what does that mean for them?
So, I mean, shrinking GDP means businesses are producing less, people are spending less, and the overall wealth of the country is declining. So this can result in, people losing jobs, businesses closing, and, a decrease in the standard of living overall.
And it's not just the entire economy as a whole. There are certain industries that are really feeling the pressure more than others, right? Like
Yeah.
agriculture.
Yeah, agriculture is really a fascinating case study in how interconnected everything is. I mean, Israel has always been known for their very, very advanced ag tech. But, even with all the innovation, they rely heavily on having a consistent workforce.
So that workforce has been disrupted.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
What's happened?
Well, almost 10,000 Thai agricultural workers, and these workers are crucial during harvest, left the country following the Hamas attacks, and also restrictions on Palestinian workers being able to enter Israel from the West Bank have really added to this problem.
So you've got like this kind of double whammy of worker shortages. You've got the Thai workers leaving, and the Palestinian workers are unable to fill in those gaps. What does that look like on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, they're seeing crops rot in fields because they simply don't have the manpower to harvest them.
Wow.
Yeah, and this leads to, immediate loss for these farmers, but also, down the road, what does this do to food prices? What does it do to food supply?
It's like a domino effect. One problem leads to another problem. And speaking of dominoes, tourism has been hit really hard too, right?
Oh, of course. Tourism is so sensitive to any sign of instability. As you can imagine, it's taken a huge hit. Our source here points out that in the first 6 months of 2023, they had over 2 million visitors coming into Israel. And then in that same period this year, that number's dropped to just over 500,000.
Oh, wow.
So we're talking about, roughly a 76% drop. So if you can imagine like 3 out of every 4 tourists that normally visit your city decide not to come, you can see the impact that that would have.
And that's a lot of money lost. For businesses that rely on tourism.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're talking about $4.9 billion that the Israeli tourism industry has lost in the past year. And it's not just, big hotels that are feeling it. Think about all the tour guides, the restaurants, the souvenir shops, transportation services. Everyone that relies on that tourist dollar is hurting.
Now, you said earlier that tourism is kind of a barometer for stability. Do you think the decline in tourism is solely due to safety concerns? Or are there other things at play here?
Well, safety is obviously like a huge factor. Nobody wants to go somewhere where they don't feel safe. But it also creates this huge sense of uncertainty. Like when a region is in conflict, it becomes difficult for businesses to plan. Investors are going to be less likely to commit. Tourists, they're not going to book trips because they're not sure what the situation is going to be like in the future. So, people are really hesitant to travel to places where, things are unpredictable.
Yeah, who wants to go on vacation and, have to worry about all that? It's interesting that you brought up investors because it seems like another area that's really vital to Israel's economy. Their technology sector is being affected too.
Yeah, the tech sector is really, the one that everyone's watching because it has been such a success story for Israel. I mean, it contributes something like 17% of their GDP. But, even this powerhouse is showing some cracks.
Yeah, and the source we have here mentions a 55% decrease in investment funding, and that's since the conflict began. And for a sector that thrives on innovation and growth, that's pretty significant.
It really is. Investors are really skittish. They don't like instability. They're worried about their money, being tied up in a place where there's so much conflict. And they don't know if companies are even going to be able to function, effectively when there's all this going on.
And what about the people that work at these tech companies? Are they feeling this too?
Absolutely. We're already starting to see Israeli tech companies relocate their offices and personnel. Yeah, they're heading to Europe to find some more stable ground.
Interesting.
Yeah. And if we start to see skilled workers leave in big numbers, it could really impact Israel's, long-term ability to be competitive in the tech world.
Yeah, like they're losing a key ingredient in their secret sauce, so to speak.
Exactly. And this feeling of unease and uncertainty is creeping into other sectors as well, like construction and real estate.
Yeah, those are often seen as kind of like bellwethers for the health of an economy. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's not good. Construction projects are stalling because there just aren't enough workers. And the real estate market is, bracing for a potential wave of mortgage defaults. And I think, remember what we said earlier about shrinking GDP leading to job losses? Well, we're seeing that play out here as well.
And again, it's all connected, right? Construction impacts real estate, which then affects banks and the entire financial system. So it all kind of trickles down.
It really does. And this leads to something that I think is really important and often overlooked in these types of discussions about economics, and it's the human factor.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in numbers and percentages and all that, but these are real people, that are being affected. What are some of those stories that are coming out of this crisis?
So, for one thing, 250,000 Israelis have been called up to fight, right?
Wow.
Yeah, so that means they've left their jobs, they've left their businesses. It's a huge chunk of the workforce that's suddenly unavailable, and that's going to disrupt productivity and economic output. And then you also have 140,000 Palestinian workers from the West Bank that are now barred from entering Israel. So
Right.
that impacts their livelihood, of course, but it also exacerbates the labor shortage in Israel and really kind of adds fuel to this economic fire that's going on.
Yeah. So no-win situation for everybody involved.
Yeah.
So, what is the Israeli government doing to try to put out these fires? What kind of steps are they taking to mitigate some of this damage?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what we're going to dig into after a quick break. So before the break, we were talking about the government's response to all of this, and it's complicated, to say the least. I mean, our source here points to some pretty worrisome indicators, like credit rating agencies, those financial watchdogs that are kind of always assessing a country's ability to repay its debts. They've taken notice. Both Fitch and Moody's, which are two of the major players in this space, have downgraded Israel's credit rating.
So, for those of us who aren't, fluent in finance, what does that mean? What do those downgrades actually mean?
Okay, so basically a credit rating downgrade makes it more expensive for a country to borrow money. It's kind of like your personal credit score.
Hmm?
So if you have a good credit score, you get loans at lower interest rates, right?
Yeah.
But if your score is low, lenders see you as more of a risk, and so they're going to charge you a premium. That premium comes in the form of higher interest rates.
So it's kind of like a warning signal to investors, right? It's like, hey, be careful.
Exactly. It's saying there's more risk involved in investing in this country now, and it has this ripple effect across the entire economy. It can scare away foreign investors, make it harder for businesses to get loans, and, potentially even lead to higher taxes as the government tries to make up for the fact that it's costing them more to borrow money.
So that puts even more pressure on Netanyahu.
Yeah.
He's facing criticism from both sides.
Yeah, he is. And our source mentions that, there's this growing kind of discontent within the business community. You have these prominent business leaders calling for new leadership, saying that Netanyahu's really focused on security at the expense of economic stability. So it creates this real catch-22 for him, How do you balance the immediate needs for security with the long-term health of the economy?
It's like a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation. Because you need those security measures to protect the country and its citizens. But at the same time, those measures can hurt the economy, which then weakens the country and makes it less stable. So it's kind of like a vicious cycle.
It really is. And this all leads to this big question: what's going to happen long term if this conflict drags on? I mean, it's not just the immediate impacts, but, the potential for this deeper, more lasting damage.
So unpack that a little bit. Like,
Yeah.
what are the long-term risks that we should really be paying attention to here?
Well, one major thing is what we've already talked about, the erosion of investor confidence. We see the decline in tech investment, but this could easily spread to other sectors as well. Investors are really looking for stability,
Mhm.
predictability. They want to be able to put their money in a place where they know things are going to be okay. And conflict creates the opposite of that.
Yeah, it's like trying to build a house on sand. Like you need
Yeah.
that solid foundation for long-term growth.
Right, exactly. And if investment dries up, it becomes harder for businesses to do anything, to grow, to innovate, to create jobs. And it can lead to this, cycle of stagnation. It's tough to break free from that.
And are we talking about like a potential brain drain too?
Hmm.
Like skilled workers, entrepreneurs, the folks that really drive innovation, are they going to start looking for opportunities elsewhere if they don't think Israel's future is all that bright?
Yeah, for sure. And again, we're already seeing it in the tech sector. Companies are relocating, skilled workers are leaving. And if this continues, it could really drain Israel's pool of talent and innovation, which will make it that much harder for them to compete globally.
Yeah, it's like they're losing that thing that's always given them an edge.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly. And this is something that also is often overlooked. I mean, we talk a lot about the economic impacts, but what about the impact on the social fabric of the country? Prolonged economic hardship can lead to unrest, political polarization, even violence.
so it's not just about the economy itself, but about the people
Yeah.
and the culture.
Exactly. I mean, when people are struggling to put food on the table, when they feel like their livelihoods are being threatened, it creates this environment where division and instability can fester. And of course, that can hurt the economy even further. It's a really dangerous spiral.
So it's like a ripple effect, but instead of spreading outwards in water, it's negativity and instability.
Yeah.
So is there any light at the end of the tunnel here? Are there any solutions to this kind of economic quagmire?
I mean, the obvious solution, which is also the hardest to achieve, is finding a resolution to this conflict. If there were, some kind of lasting peace, it would not only save lives, but it would also unleash so much economic potential for the entire region. Imagine what could happen if these two economies could cooperate, and thrive together.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thought. But given how entrenched these positions are and all the mistrust, what are the chances of that happening anytime soon?
I think, honestly, the chances are pretty slim at this point. But that doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and give up, right?
Yeah.
Even small steps towards dialogue and cooperation can create positive economic ripple effects. And in the meantime, the Israeli government does have options. There are things they can do to try to mitigate the damage.
Okay, so like give me some specifics. What can they do?
Well, for one thing, they could focus on diversifying the economy. Right now, they're really reliant on a handful of sectors like technology and tourism, and those are the sectors that are the most vulnerable in a situation like this. So if they could develop, say, a more robust manufacturing base or invest in renewable energy, that could create new sources of growth and employment. And that makes the economy more resilient to these kinds of global market fluctuations and instability.
So kind of spreading the risk a little bit, not
Yeah.
putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And then they really need to do something about the labor shortage. And that means attracting skilled workers from other countries, providing training and education for Israelis to fill these in-demand roles, and maybe even finding ways to reintegrate Palestinian workers into the economy in a way that's safe and legal.
And that last one, I mean, that's pretty sensitive politically, right?
Oh, absolutely. But from an economic standpoint, it just makes sense. I mean, Palestinian workers have played such a significant role in so many different sectors. And facilitating their employment, it's not just about addressing the labor needs, but it could also foster some level of economic cooperation, which could, lead to greater stability.
It's a tricky balance for sure, but the potential upside is huge. So we've talked about the problems, the risks, and some possible solutions. But what do you think is the most overlooked aspect of this whole situation?
I think we often lose sight of the human cost when we talk about all these economic indicators, you know?
Hmm.
It's easy to get caught up in GDP and investment figures and unemployment rates, but we have to remember that every one of those numbers represents a real person, someone whose life is being deeply affected by this conflict. People are losing their jobs, their homes, their sense of security. Their dreams are on hold, and their future is uncertain.
It's a good reminder that economics isn't just about numbers. It's about people's lives. And speaking of people, our source mentioned something pretty interesting. There's this group of prominent Israeli business leaders, and they seem to be getting really frustrated with the current situation. So much so that they're considering taking things into their own hands.
Yeah, this is fascinating. These are individuals that, historically have been more focused on profits and growth. Politics wasn't really their thing. But now they're really worried that the political climate is jeopardizing everything, their businesses, the future of the Israeli economy, everything.
So are they starting to kind of flex their political muscle a little bit?
It seems that way. I mean, they have the resources, they have the influence, and now they have the motivation to really shake things up. They're even thinking about forming their own political party or maybe supporting existing ones that align with their views on the economy and the need for a change in direction.
Wow, so we could actually see a shift in the political landscape. Do you think these business leaders could be the ones to make that happen?
It's possible, they definitely bring a new perspective, and their economic power gives them a lot of clout. So we'll have to wait and see if that translates into actual policy changes or maybe even a shift in political power. But it's definitely something worth keeping an eye on.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already really complicated situation. It's interesting how this conflict is impacting not just the economy, but the politics within Israel as well. It seems like everyone's kind of scrambling for a way forward.
They are. And the stakes are high. The decisions that are made over the next few months, could have huge implications for Israel's economic future and its place in the world.
And speaking of implications, we talked about those credit rating downgrades from Fitch and Moody's, and now it looks like Standard and Poor's, another major agency, has also issued a warning about the risks of investing in Israel right now.
Yeah, that's a big deal. I mean, when you have multiple credit rating agencies all sounding the alarm, it sends a very clear signal to the global financial community that something's wrong. And it really underscores the point that this isn't just a regional issue. This is a global economic issue.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're all interconnected.
Mm.
What happens in one part of the world can easily spill over into others. It's like a chain reaction, but on a global scale. What happens in Israel doesn't stay in Israel.
Exactly. And this leads to something else that we haven't really touched on yet, the psychological impact on Israeli society. I mean, we've talked about anxieties, the uncertainty, but, imagine living under constant threat and watching your country's economy struggle. It has to take a toll.
Yeah, it's almost like a collective trauma. It's a wound that can take a long time to heal. How do you live with that kind of tension? How does it affect your outlook on the future, your sense of hope, even your willingness to invest, not just financially, but emotionally?
Those are really important questions, and they often get overshadowed by all the economic and political analysis, but they're essential to understanding what's really going on here. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams, their very sense of being.
Exactly. And those are often the hardest costs to quantify, but they're probably the ones that last the longest.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've really explored the fallout from this conflict, the economics, the politics, the potential solutions or lack thereof, and the human cost.
Yeah, we've looked at the data, examined the trends, and really tried to understand the nuances of this very, very complex situation. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Given everything we've talked about today, what do you think the long-term economic consequences are going to be for Israel if this conflict keeps escalating? Like, what are the potential scenarios that we should be prepared for?
That's a really important question, and one that we all need to consider very carefully. I mean, we've seen how this conflict has already rattled the foundations of Israel's economy. And if things continue on this path, the consequences could be really significant. They could even change things permanently.
Yeah, it's not a very optimistic outlook, and it really shows how important it is to find a way to peace and stability, not just for Israel and Palestine, but for the whole region and really the world.
I agree. The whole world is watching, and the decisions that are made or not made in the next few months will have a huge impact way beyond the borders of this conflict.
All right, so we're back, and we've been having this really in-depth conversation about the economic fallout from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we've talked about a lot, everything from how different industries are being hit to the potential solutions, and even the human cost of this whole thing. And it's heavy stuff. But I think it's really important that we talk about it and really understand just how complicated all this is.
Yeah, you can't just scratch the surface, right? You gotta go deeper and really look at what's happening under the hood, especially when things are this tense and this volatile.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one of the big takeaways here is that, we hear so much about this conflict being a political crisis or a humanitarian crisis, which it is, of course,
Mhm.
but it's also an economic crisis.
Yeah.
And it's having a big impact. I mean, a really big impact.
It is. I mean, we've seen what it's done to an economy that was, not that long ago considered really, really strong and vibrant. I mean, tourism is really hurting. The tech sector, which was this, amazing engine of innovation that's even showing signs of strain. And even agriculture, which is so essential to Israel's economy, is having a really rough time. And all this is happening at the same time that inflation's going up, credit ratings are being downgraded, and there's just this overall sense of, what's going to happen next? What's the future hold?
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. And I think a lot of our listeners are probably wondering, okay, what does this mean for Israel down the road? Not just, the next few months, but long term. What's the big picture here?
Well, one of the things that I think is really worrying is that this could turn into a really long economic downturn. I mean, if the conflict keeps escalating and investors just keep getting spooked, it could lead to this period of stagnation. And that would make it really hard for Israel to recover. And that would obviously have a big impact on, people's quality of life, their jobs, their well-being.
And again, it's not just about economics. I mean, you have to think about the social impact too, the psychological impact. How does all this constant conflict, this uncertainty affect people? I mean, they're living with this every single day.
It's a great point, and it's something that's hard to measure. But the psychological toll that this takes on people, it's huge. It can lead to, all sorts of problems, anxiety, stress, trauma. People might be afraid to invest in their business, to plan for the future, or even to just enjoy their lives. They're living with this cloud over their head all the time, and that can really impact society as a whole. Mental health, social cohesion, all those things suffer.
Yeah, it's like a weight that's just dragging everything down. So it's
Yeah.
it's understandable that people are looking for some kind of, I don't know, some reason to be optimistic, some glimmer of hope.
Yeah. And there are some things that could potentially change the situation. We talked about those business leaders who are getting increasingly frustrated with how things are going. They're the ones who are seeing firsthand how much damage is being done to the economy. And now they're starting to speak up and maybe even try to push for a different approach, one that, focuses on economic stability and maybe, just maybe, even jumpstarts peace negotiations.
I mean, it's interesting that it's the business community that's starting to really push for change.
Mm.
I mean, you often think of them as being, bottom line focused, but this really shows you just how deeply this conflict is affecting everyone in Israel.
It does. And we don't know yet if they'll be successful in changing things, but the fact that they're stepping up at all, that shows you that there's a real desire for something different, a recognition that, this can't go on forever.
Right. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've talked about the economic fallout from this conflict, the politics surrounding it, and, even the human cost. We've really gone deep and tried to uncover the layers of this, really, really complicated issue.
Yeah.
And I think, we've done a good job of highlighting the challenges, the risks, and the few signs of hope that we see out there. But, ultimately, I think it's up to each of us to keep asking questions, to keep learning, and to keep digging deeper.
Absolutely. The more we understand, the better equipped we'll be to deal with the challenges that are coming our way, and maybe even help to create a more peaceful and prosperous future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.